Welcome to Jester's Deck List. I'm your host, the Fat Jester. Today we are going over the new enchantment-based commander, Zur, Eternal Schemer. Zur, Eternal Schemer, for 1 white, 1 blue, and 1 black, is a 1/4 human wizard with flying, and enchantment creatures you control have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. For 1 and a white, target non-aura enchantment you control becomes a creature in addition to its other types and has base power and base toughness, each equal to its mana value. This card as your commander is going to give you a huge amount of utility early and a great swinging force in the later parts of the game. So, I'm sure you already know that we will be using a lot of enchantments in the deck and then turn them into our unstoppable army at the end of the game. The way I have built my Zur deck is as a pillow fort design, making it impossible for our opponents to attack us without having to spend a large amount of resources in order to do so. Basically, your opponents are going to have to make the choice of either attacking us or being able to cast a spell or do anything else on their turn. This deck list is made for more of a casual game around power levels 6 to 7. It can easily be made into a stack style deck with just a few modifications to make it a much higher 8 to 9. With that being said, I don't see it ever being CEDH viable when stacked, no pun intended, against a more meta CEDH deck. So, to start us off, let's go over the cards that you need to make sure your pillow fort is never destroyed. These cards are designed to make sure your opponents go for everyone else instead of you, allowing you to build up your enchantments and then turn them into a massive army to sweep over the board once all your opponents are nice and low from attacking each other. Collective Restraints, for 3 and a blue, creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays X for each creature attacking you, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. Propaganda, for 2 and a blue, and Ghostly Prison, for 2 and a white, both require your opponents to pay 2 mana for each attacking creature. Orification, for 2 and 2 white, whenever a creature deals damage to you, put a gold counter on it. Each creature with a gold counter on it is a wall in addition to its other types. When Orification leaves play, remove all gold counters from all creatures. All of these cards are here to incentivize your opponents to ignore you by forcing them to spend their valuable early game mana to attack you, or not having enough mana to swing their full force at you later in the game. Orification also ensures they won't swing their heavy hitters at you more than once, giving you a nice cushion of protection from combat. Blessed Sanctuary, for 3 and 2 white, prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to you and creatures you control. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, create a 2/2 white unicorn creature token. Some decks that don't use creatures to win the game may use large spells that deal damage to end the game or wipe the board. This will prevent that from happening. Cunning Rhetoric, for 2 and a black, whenever an opponent attacks you and or 1 or more planeswalkers you control, exile the top card of that player's library. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. This is a very strong incentive for your opponents to attack other players over you, because let's be honest, no one likes having their cards stolen. Next, let's discuss the cards that are going to let you stall out the game in order to build up your massive enchantment army. Confounding Conundrum, for 1 and a blue. When Confounding Conundrum enters the battlefield, draw a card. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under their control this turn, they return a land they control to its owner's hand. This slows down any ramping decks and lets you draw a card, making it a very nice addition to the deck to stall the game out. Aegis of the Gods is a creature for 1 and a white. It is a 2/1, and it says you have hexproof. You and all of your enchantments having hexproof or access to hexproof through your commander will make your board very difficult to interact with, along with yourself. Aether Barrier, for 2 and a blue, whenever a player plays a creature spell, that player sacrifices a permanent unless he or she pays 1. You have very few creatures in the deck, so you can get away with this, and it will cause your opponents to have to spend more mana, allowing you to get ahead much quicker. Ashes of Abhorrent, for 1 and a white. Players cannot cast spells from graveyards or activate abilities of cards in graveyards. Whenever a creature dies, you gain 1 life. This is just in case you're playing against a recursion deck. If your playgroup doesn't really have any recursion effects, then this can be swapped out for something else to help you with your specific playgroup. Aura of Silence, for 1 and 2 white. Artifacts and enchantment spells your opponents cast cost 2 more. Sacrifice Aura of Silence, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Having your opponent's mana rocks cost 2 more is a great way to slow them down, and being able to remove any big threats later on is a very nice aspect of this card. Blind Obedience for 1 and a white, it has Extort. Artifacts and creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. This is going to slow your opponents down and give you a nice way to gain life throughout the game and deal a little damage with Extort. Breathstealer's Crypt for 2, a blue and a black. Whenever a player draws a card, they reveal that card. If the card is a creature card, that player pays 3 life or discards the card. Having hardly any creatures in your deck allows you to get away with running this card and is a very heavy tax for any creature-based decks you come across. Citadel Siege for 2 and 2 white. As Citadel Siege enters the battlefield, choose Khans or Dragons. Khans, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. Dragons, at the beginning of combat on each opponent's turn, tap target creature that player controls. Having a card that can remove heavy hitters from your opponent's arsenal is extremely useful. And if you already have your opponents locked down, then getting a boost to your combat damage is a nice aspect of the card. Court of Cunning for 1 and 2 blue. When Court of Cunning enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. At the beginning of your upkeep, any number of target players each mill 2 cards. If you are the monarch, each of those players mills 10 cards instead. Next up is Court of Ambition for 2 and 2 black. When Court of Ambition enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. At the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card. If you're the monarch, instead, each opponent loses 6 life unless they discard 2 cards. Both of these allow you to thin out either the hand or deck of your opponents. But be careful, however, as they will put a target on your back because you are negatively affecting the entire board. Next is our combat enchantments, giving your enchantment creatures an extra boost in combat to help you wrap up the game. Court of Grace for 2 and 2 white. When Court of Grace enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. At the beginning of your upkeep, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. If you're the monarch, create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying instead. Bitter Blossom for 1 and a black. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and create a 1/1 black fairy rogue creature token with flying. Both of these, giving you those extra tokens for combat, will be able to make you wrap up the game much quicker. Next up is Attrition for 1 and 2 black. You pay 1 black mana to sacrifice a creature to destroy target non-black creature. Using the tokens generated from Bitter Blossom or Court of Grace to destroy your opponent's big creatures can be very useful to let you get in with combat damage in the later portions of the game. Next up, we have the 2 archetypes of the deck, Archetype of Imagination and Archetype of Courage. Archetype of Imagination for 4 and 2 blue is a 3/2 enchantment creature. Creatures you control have flying. Creatures your opponents control lose flying and cannot have or gain flying. Archetype of Courage for 1 and 2 white is a 2/2 enchantment creature. Creatures you control have first strike. Creatures your opponents control lose first strike and cannot have or gain first strike. These 2 archetypes are here to help you get through any blockers your opponents may have available even after you lock down the board. Giving your creatures flying and making your opponents lose flying is of course an easy way to get around any blockers. Along with having your Death Touch creatures with first strike allows your creatures to kill any blockers without suffering any damage themselves, incentivizing your opponents to not block. Next up is Always Watching for 1 and 2 white. Non-token creatures you control get +1/+1 and have Vigilance. This card, giving all your creatures a +1/+1, is nice, but having all your creatures have Vigilance, making sure that even when you swing out, you will still have a large blocking force just in case you have an opponent that really wants to swing in, even through all your pillow fort. Athreos, God of Passage, for 1, a white and a black, is a 5/4 enchantment creature that has Indestructible. As long as your devotion to white and black is less than 7, Athreos is not a creature. Whenever another creature you own dies, return it to your hand unless target opponent pays 3 life. Not only do you get an Indestructible, Lifelink, Hexproof, and Death Touch 5/4 for just 5 mana, or only 3 mana if it's later in the game and you have the devotion, but it also has a chance to get your enchantments back if an opponent manages to kill one. Behind the Scenes, for 2 and a black, creatures you control have Skulk. They can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. For 4 and a white, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Since most of your enchantments are not more than 4 mana, this card allows you to get through if your opponent's creatures are bigger, which most of the time in the later portion of the game, they will be. It can also act as a mana sink later on. Campaign of Vengeance is up next. For 3, a white and a black, whenever a creature you control attacks, defending player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Even if your creature, for whatever reason, cannot connect to an opponent, this allows you to not only get a small bit of damage, but also some life gain, not to mention a 5/5 for 5 is always pretty decent. Coastal Piracy for 2 and 2 blue. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. Your creatures will be almost impossible to stop from getting in to deal damage, so having a card draw enchantment will help in the later portions of the game so you can keep your hands full of those nasty enchantments. Next up, we have our creature/artifact control portion of the deck, and all of these cards on the screen now do basically the same thing, either tapping a creature down, making it unable to untap, exiling a creature or artifact, and last but certainly not least, gaining control of a creature or artifact. These should be used to remove large threats from the table, such as commanders or other creatures/artifacts that can cause your opponents to win the game. We have Consulate Crackdown, Confiscate, Conclave Tribunal, Compulsory Rest, Coma Veil, Claustrophobia, Choking Restraints, Cast Out, Borrowed Time, Ashiok's Erasure, Banishing Light, Corrupted Conscience, Swords to Plowshare, and Path to Exile. Next up are the counterspells. Counterspells are a decisive card type in the Magic community. I have found that most people either love playing counter magic or hate anyone who plays it. If your play group is fine with counter magic, then here are some great cards. But again, this is all up to you when you are building your deck. If you want a higher power rating, then only use the best counter magic available. If you want your power level to be a bit lower, then use more expensive CMC counterspells to make it quote-unquote more fair. We have Dovin's Veto, Counterspell, Counter Squall, Disdainful Stroke, Saw It Coming, Mana Tithe, Arcane Denial, Negate, and Cryptic Command. Next up is the tutors. If tutors are something you are comfortable using in your decks, you have access to some of the best tutors in the game with the colors available to you. Vampiric, Demonic, Idyllic, and Enlightened Tutor are there just to name a few. Your commander is the most vulnerable card in your deck, meaning you will need some form of protection, whether it be a flicker effect, or hexproof, or shroud effect. There are many cards that can do this. Some are more popular than others. Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves are some of the most popular commander protection in the game. Here are a few more cards that I couldn't find anywhere to fit in any of the categories for the deck, but are some great includes in my opinion. Copy Enchantment and As Foretold. Copy Enchantment is a great card because it's literally the best enchantment you have in your deck on the field at the time. As Foretold, cheating out any kind of CMC, even if it takes a while to ramp up, is always a good include in any deck. Next up is Copy Artifact. While this is the priciest card on the deck list, it is of course a great include because at any point in the game, it is the best artifact on the field. Next up is the mana base. This depends on how expensive you want the deck to be, and if you want it to be a little more powerful, by having all the good mana rocks such as the Legal Moxens and the expensive non-tap dual lands. The deck of course will function with nothing but basic lands and cards like Evolving Wilds for mana fixing. However, the more tuned and expensive your mana base is, the more consistent and quicker your deck will be. This of course means that the power level will increase. Thank you for watching. I would like to give a huge shout out to my friend Eli for editing this video. And if you enjoyed the deck, a like and a sub would be greatly appreciated. This has been Jester's Deck List with the Fat Jester. I pass the turn.